The American food system made a deliberate decision about this fish. Not a mistake, not an oversight, a decision, documented in regulatory filings, lobbying records, and federal agency guidelines that are publicly available to anyone willing to read them. The decision was this: a fish that produces more protein per acre than cattle, pigs, and chickens combined, that eats algae requiring no purchased feed, that has sustained human populations across 3 continents for over 4,000 years, would be classified as a dangerous invasive species in 47 states. The farmers who might have raised it would face permitting requirements so extensive and expensive that most could not comply. The knowledge of how to farm it at household scale would quietly exit the American agricultural curriculum, and the United States would import 475 million pounds of it every year from China and Latin America instead. The fish did not change, the biology did not change, the nutritional profile did not change. The decision changed, and the story of who made that decision and why tells you almost everything you need to know about who controls what Americans are permitted to grow for themselves. This is tilapia, Oreochromis niloticus, the Nile fish. For over 4,000 years, from the flood ponds of ancient Egypt to the subsistence farms of sub-Saharan Africa, to the aquaponic homesteads quietly operating across America today, it has been the protein system that required the least from the people who needed it most. The fish that eats what grows for free and produces what no other system produces at the same cost. The Nile Delta, approximately 2000 BC, a year when the river ran lower than expected. The annual flooding of the Nile is the foundation of everything this woman's family grows and eats, but this year the flood came shallow. The natural delivery of fish into her collection ponds along the river's edge was thin, fewer fish than the previous 3 seasons. Her neighbors are eating less. Some have already begun the walk to the grain stores in the nearest town. She does not make that walk. She spends 3 days deepening the channels that connect her ponds to the river. She widens the collection basin on the downstream side. She manages the algae growth along the shallow edges, not clearing it, tending it, because she understands what her mother understood and her mother's mother before that. The fish do not need her to feed them. They need her to feed what feeds them. The algae is the system, the fish are the harvest. The smell of warm Nile pond water in early morning, green, mineral, alive. The smell of standing water that has found its biological balance reaches her before she even checks the nets. It is not the smell of clean water, it is the smell of productive water. There is a difference, and she knows it. Within 6 weeks, her ponds are producing again. Her family eats fish 3 times a week through the dry season. Her neighbors are eating brain purchased from stores an hour's walk away. The gap between those 2 outcomes is a woman who understood the biology of a fish that eats what grows for free. That understanding is what this report is recovering. Archaeologists have found tilapia bones in Egyptian middens dating to 25,500 BC, making this one of the oldest documented food-fish relationships in human history. By 1400 BC, the practice is sophisticated enough to appear in tomb art. The tomb of Nakht, a scribe who lived during the reign of Thutmose IV, contains wall paintings showing tilapia being harvested from estate ponds. The fish appears in hieroglyphic texts as a symbol of rebirth and abundance. It had its own religious iconography. This was not subsistence fishing. This was a complete self-sustaining food system that required almost no labor beyond the initial pond construction. Roman fish ponds along the North African coast raised tilapia alongside other species. Arab traders carried the fish east into the Persian Gulf region following the same routes that carried spices and textiles. By the medieval period, tilapia was a staple protein across sub-Saharan Africa, growing wild in Lake Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi in populations so dense that local fishermen could harvest them with hand nets from the shore. The Fisheries Research Institute of Uganda has documented continuous tilapia farming on Lake Victoria using traditional pond systems for over 400 years, through colonization, through political upheaval, through 2 decades of international development pressure to adopt industrial aquaculture. The knowledge survived because the biology was too reliable for the people who depended on it to abandon. By the 1940s, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization was promoting tilapia aquaculture in developing nations as a low-cost solution to protein deficiency. They called it the aquatic chicken. The comparison was intentional. Tilapia could make animal protein cheap and producible at the household level the way the broiler chicken had done in the industrialized world. By the 1960s, tilapia farming programs were running in 80 countries. In rural communities across Kenya, Ghana, and the Philippines, household protein consumption measurably increased wherever tilapia ponds were introduced. The United States introduced tilapia in the 1950s and 1960s, not for food, but for weed control. Water management agencies in Florida and Texas imported the fish to clear overgrown irrigation canals and reservoirs. It worked. But in warm southern waterways, tilapia thrived beyond what anyone anticipated. They reproduced rapidly, established wild populations, and in some waterways altered aquatic vegetation dramatically enough to change entire ecosystems. This is a real ecological concern. Introduced species cause genuine damage, and tilapia in warm American waterways is a legitimate management challenge. That part of the story is true. What followed was not proportionate management, it was regulatory capture. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as tilapia farming expanded rapidly across Asia and Latin America, the American commercial fishing industry was watching with concern. The catfish farming industry in the Mississippi Delta, the trout farming industry in Idaho, the broader commercial seafood lobby, all recognized the same thing. Tilapia was cheap to produce, easy to farm, and if it became widely established in American aquaculture, it would undercut their prices and their market share. The lobbying effort that followed was not dramatic or visible. It accumulated gradually through state-level restrictions, federal listing decisions, and agency guidelines that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively created an almost impenetrable barrier to tilapia farming. By the 1990s, tilapia had been listed as prohibited or restricted in 47 states. Here is what Kevin Fitzsimmons, tilapia aquaculture specialist at the University of Arizona, documented in peer-reviewed academic papers going back to the 1990s. Tilapia cannot survive water temperatures below approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Minnesota's average January temperature is 13 degrees. Maine's is 17. Montana's is 20. A tilapia that escaped a farm pond in any of these states in October would be dead by November. The ecological risk was not minimal, it was functionally zero. The restrictions applied anyway. Fitzsimmons documented that species with comparable ecological risk profiles faced far less restrictive regulatory treatment, in part because they had established industry advocates participating in the regulatory process. Tilapia had no American industry lobby. The people who would have benefited most from tilapia farming were small-scale farmers, rural communities, and low-income households, exactly the people with the least access to regulatory processes and the least ability to hire lobbyists. The result? The United States became the world's largest importer of tilapia, consuming approximately 475 million pounds annually, almost all of it from China and Latin America. The regulatory framework did not reduce American tilapia consumption. It simply ensured that the money Americans spent on tilapia went overseas instead of to American rural communities. The biological case for tilapia is not marginal or contested. A single acre of properly managed tilapia pond produces between 5,000 and 10,000 pounds of fish annually. A single acre of cattle pasture produces approximately 200 pounds of beef with continuous purchased inputs. Commercial salmon farming requires approximately 5 pounds of wild-caught fish to produce 1 pound of farmed salmon. Tilapia farming runs a surplus, not a deficit. They eat phytoplankton, algae, and aquatic plants that cost nothing and grow without human effort. 100 grams of tilapia delivers approximately 26 grams of protein, comparable to chicken breast with less saturated fat. Reviews in Aquaculture published a 2018 study documenting that integrated tilapia vegetable aquaponic systems produce 50 to 70% more food per unit of water than conventional agriculture, while using 90% less water than soil farming. The WUSDA has access to this data. The extension offices operating in every American county have access to this data. The academic literature is open access. The gap between what the data shows and what American farmers are permitted to do is not a gap of knowledge. It is a gap of who was in the room when the regulations were written. The 25,500-year archaeological record, the Kevin Fitzsimmons documentation, the 47-state restriction map, and the 475 million pounds of annual imports have been building toward. How does the federal government simultaneously fund eradication programs for a fish in states where its ecological risk is functionally zero, where winter temperatures guarantee it cannot survive escape, while importing hundreds of millions of pounds of that same fish from China every year to feed American households? The ecological justification was real in Florida and Texas. It was not real in Minnesota, Maine, and Montana. The restriction applied in Minnesota, Maine, and Montana anyway. Nobody sat in a room and decided to ban a fish that could feed the poor. What happened was more ordinary and in some ways more troubling. Industry groups participated in regulatory processes the way they always do. The people who would have benefited from a different outcome were not in the room, and the outcome served the people who were. They could not restrict it everywhere. In Rwanda, following the genocide of 1994, international aid organizations introduced tilapia aquaculture as part of the reconstruction effort. By 2010, farmers were producing tilapia in cage systems on Lake Kivu, in hillside pond systems, and in small backyard tanks in urban areas. Wageningen University tracked the results between 2010 and 2018. Households with tilapia ponds had significantly higher protein consumption. Children showed better growth outcomes. The economic return on a small tilapia pond exceeded the return on an equivalent investment in any conventional crop. One farmer named Celestine Inanna built a small pond on a quarter-acre of land previously too wet and poorly drained to grow anything. He stocked it with tilapia fingerlings from a government hatchery and fed them kitchen scraps and duckweed that grew naturally in the pond. Within 8 months, he was harvesting enough fish to feed his family 3 times a week, with surplus to sell at the local market. His total investment was the labor to dig the pond and a few dollars for fingerlings. That is the outcome the American regulatory framework made impossible for American farmers to replicate. On Lake Victoria, the traditional tilapia farming systems documented by the Fisheries Research Institute of Uganda have operated continuously for over 400 years, through everything, because the biology was too reliable and the food security too essential to abandon for a system that required purchasing inputs nobody could afford. Here is what you can do with this information today. Check your state regulations first. The American Tilapia Association maintains a current state-by-state regulatory guide available through their website. In most northern states, closed-system aquaculture, tanks or greenhouses where fish cannot escape into natural waterways, is now legally permitted. This is the correct starting point before any investment in equipment. For indoor closed-system farming, a 300-gallon stock tank, an air pump, basic filtration, and 30 to 40 tilapia fingerlings from a licensed hatchery is the complete starting investment. Feed costs can be reduced to near zero by growing duckweed in a separate container. It doubles its biomass in less than 48 hours, and tilapia eat it readily. For integrated aquaponics systems, tilapia waste provides the nitrogen that fertilizes vegetables growing in a connected hydroponic bed. The plants filter the water for the fish. The system is self-regulating once established. The World Fish Center's open-access research library contains documented smallholder aquaponics designs tested across multiple climate conditions. Somewhere on Lake Victoria right now, a fisher is pulling tilapia from water her grandmother fished and her grandmother's grandmother fished. The same fish, the same biology, the same system that a woman on the Nile floodplain tended 4,000 years ago because she understood something the American regulatory framework spent 50 years trying to make you forget. The fish eats what grows for free. It always has. What you just heard is one file from an archive that runs deeper than any single video can reach. Every food system that required no purchased input to function, every protein source that served the people with the least before it threatened the profits of the people with the most, every regulatory decision that protected a market instead of a public, they all have a file, and every file has the same ending. Buried not because it failed, but because it succeeded at the wrong person's expense. Thank you for watching this video till the end. If you found value in it, ensure you give us a thumbs up and share it to the general public. See you in our next video. Stay tuned.